If you can buy this whole lot, I'll quit today. The laughter came fast and loud, bouncing off the glass walls of the luxury showroom like it belonged there. Beneath rows of polished supercars glowing under white lights, Brandon Whitmore folded his arms and smirked at the man standing near the entrance. Darius Coleman didn't answer right away. He simply looked across the floor where a crimson Ferrari sat beside a black Lamborghini and a silver McLaren. The reflections shimmered across their curves like liquid metal. Around him salespeople exchanged amused glances. Several customers stopped pretending to browse and openly watched. Brandon enjoyed moments like this. They made him feel important. He had spent years building a reputation as the top manager in the dealership, and he believed he could size people up within seconds. To him, expensive watches, flashy jackets, and loud confidence meant money. Simplicity meant someone was wasting his time. Darius wore none of the signals Brandon respected. A plain charcoal shirt. Dark jeans. Clean boots. No entourage. No display. No attempt to impress anyone. Brandon took a slow step forward and gestured dramatically toward the long line of exotic vehicles stretching across the showroom floor. A few employees chuckled before he even spoke. They already knew what was coming. "Go ahead," Brandon said. "Pick one. We can all pretend you're shopping." More laughter followed. Darius remained still. The scent of leather and fresh polish filled the air around him. Somewhere near the service desk a coffee machine hissed softly. The entire showroom felt bright, controlled, and carefully designed to make visitors feel smaller than the machines surrounding them. Brandon thrived in that environment. "Actually," Darius said calmly, his voice low enough that people leaned forward to hear, "I was hoping to look at the full inventory." The answer only encouraged Brandon. He spread his hands toward the rows of vehicles as if presenting a stage. "The full inventory," he repeated. "That's a good one." Even more people turned to watch now. Phones slowly appeared. Not because anyone expected something important to happen. They simply thought. They were witnessing harmless entertainment. Darius noticed every face. Every smile. Every raised eyebrow. Yet his expression never changed. Brandon mistook the silence for embarrassment. "Let me save you some time," he said. "The tires on some of these cars cost more than most people spend in a year." A salesman beside him laughed so hard he nearly dropped his tablet. Darius looked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows where sunlight spilled across the showroom tiles. The brightness reflected off the vehicles and painted shifting patterns across the polished floor. For a brief moment he seemed completely detached from the crowd around him. That calmness irritated Brandon more than any argument could have. He wanted a reaction. He wanted frustration. Instead he found patience. And patience felt strangely powerful. The room buzzed with amusement, but beneath the noise something else was beginning to form. Nobody could see it yet. Not Brandon. Not the employees. Not the customers holding their phones. But the moment they would remember for years had already begun. Darius let the laughter pass through the room without acknowledging it. His eyes remained on the vehicles arranged beneath the bright ceiling lights, each machine positioned with deliberate precision. The Ferrari near the center platform sat slightly higher than the others, angled to catch every reflection from the showroom windows. Beyond it stood a row of Lamborghinis, their sharp lines glowing beneath the white light. A silver McLaren rested near the far wall like a sculpture. Most visitors saw luxury. Darius saw details. He noticed inventory tags, delivery dates, inspection stickers, and even the subtle wear on a display stand that should have been replaced months ago. Brandon watched him carefully now. The manager expected irritation or embarrassment, but neither appeared. Instead, Darius walked deeper into the showroom at an unhurried pace. His boots made soft sounds against the polished floor. A young salesman stepped aside to let him pass, still smiling to himself. Darius stopped beside a dark blue Lamborghini and studied the information card. He read every line. Engine specifications. Mileage. Import records. Optional packages. His attention lingered longer than Brandon expected. Most people pretending to shop looked at colors and prices. Darius examined facts. Across the room, customers continued whispering. Some glanced between him and Brandon as though waiting for another joke. Others returned to their conversations. The excitement from a few moments earlier began to fade. Yet Brandon could not let it go. Something about Darius bothered him. Perhaps it was the calm. Perhaps it was the confidence hidden beneath the silence. Whatever the reason, Brandon found himself following several yards behind. "You really like reading those cards," he called out. "Most people just ask questions." Darius looked up briefly. "The cards answer many questions." Brandon laughed. "Not the important ones." Darius returned his attention to the vehicle. "That depends on the question." For the first time, Brandon did not have an immediate comeback. The exchange was small, but several nearby customers noticed it. One woman lowered the brochure she had been reading. Another man paused beside a red Ferrari and listened. Darius continued walking. He stopped at nearly every vehicle, taking his time. He examined craftsmanship, reviewed specifications, and occasionally looked toward the service department visible through a glass partition. Nothing about his behavior suggested uncertainty. In fact, the longer he remained in the showroom, the more familiar he appeared with the environment. Brandon folded his arms again. "You know a lot about cars?" he asked. "Enough." "Enough for what?" Darius looked toward the far end of the building where another row of exotic vehicles stood beneath hanging banners. "Enough to know when something is being presented well." The answer caught Brandon off guard. He glanced around instinctively. The showroom was his pride. Every display reflected his standards. Yet Darius had not sounded impressed. He sounded observant. The difference unsettled him. Sunlight shifted across the floor as clouds moved outside. Bright reflections slid across chrome trim and glass panels. The atmosphere felt quieter now. Less like entertainment. More like evaluation. Darius paused near the largest display platform and looked across the entire showroom from one end to the other. The employees saw a visitor. Brandon saw a challenge. Neither realized that Darius had already learned far more about the dealership than anyone intended him to know. Brandon Whitmore had always believed that first impressions were facts. During 12 years in luxury automotive sales, that belief had made him successful. At least, that was what he told himself. Every morning he walked through the showroom before opening, checking display angles, adjusting lighting, and reminding his staff that appearances mattered. The dealership sold exclusivity as much as it sold cars. In Brandon's mind, wealth looked a certain way, sounded a certain way, and carried itself with a certain confidence. Anyone who did not fit that picture immediately lost his interest. That attitude had earned him admiration from some employees and quiet frustration from others. Yet nobody challenged him. His numbers were too strong. His influence was too established. And the owner rarely visited in person. Brandon operated the showroom like his own kingdom. The bright floor, the polished vehicles, and the carefully trained sales team all revolved around him. As Darius continued examining the inventory, Brandon noticed several employees watching the interaction from a distance. A young salesman named Kyle approached cautiously. "Do you want me to help him?" he asked. Brandon shook his head. "No. I have this handled." Kyle hesitated. He seemed serious. Brandon smirked. "They always seem serious." The salesman nodded and stepped away, though he did not look convinced. Across the showroom, Darius stopped beside a matte gray supercar displayed beneath a suspended spotlight. He studied the information card for several moments before turning his attention to the vehicle itself. His gaze moved slowly from the front fascia to the wheel assembly and then to the interior visible through the glass. Brandon watched from across the floor. Most visitors admired these cars. Darius evaluated them. The distinction was becoming harder to ignore. Still, Brandon refused to reconsider his assumptions. Instead, he walked over with the confidence of a man accustomed to controlling every conversation. "Let me guess," he said. "Now you are comparing engine packages." Darius glanced at him. "I am comparing management priorities." Brandon blinked. Management priorities? The way inventory is positioned tells you what leadership values. The answer landed differently than the earlier exchanges. It was not defensive. It was observational. Brandon forced a laugh. "That sounds impressive." Darius returned his attention to the vehicle. "It is just experience." Nearby customers began listening again. The atmosphere shifted subtly. What had started as amusement was becoming curiosity. A woman standing near a white Lamborghini folded her arms and watched. Two men beside a Ferrari paused their discussion. Even employees pretending to organize paperwork kept looking up. Brandon felt the attention settling on him. Normally he enjoyed being the center of the room. Today it felt different. He was no longer directing the performance. Somehow, without raising his voice or demanding attention, Darius had become the focal point. Brandon refused to let that happen. "Experience doing what exactly?" he asked. Darius met his eyes for the first time in several minutes. The showroom lights reflected softly across the glass behind him. Watching people underestimate what they do not understand. The words were calm. Almost gentle. Yet they lingered in the air long after he finished speaking. For a brief moment, nobody laughed. Nobody added a comment. The showroom seemed unusually quiet despite the distant hum of air conditioning and the faint music playing overhead. Brandon forced a smile, but something inside him tightened. He could not explain why. All he knew was that the man he had dismissed at the door was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Darius let the silence settle before moving again. He walked toward a section of the showroom reserved for limited production vehicles, where the lighting was brighter and the display platforms were elevated several inches above the floor. Most visitors drifted through this area quickly, taking photographs before moving on. Darius stopped at every vehicle. He read every specification sheet. He studied every detail. Brandon followed at a distance that was close enough to monitor him and far enough to appear casual. The manager could feel eyes tracking both of them now. Employees pretended to work. Customers pretended not to listen. Yet everyone was paying attention. Darius stopped beside a black supercar positioned beneath a suspended spotlight. "How long has this one been here?" he asked. Brandon answered immediately. 3 weeks. "Interesting. Why?" Darius glanced at the information card. "The tires suggest closer to 5. Brandon frowned. "You can tell that?" "Wear patterns can reveal many things." A few nearby customers exchanged looks. Brandon quickly recovered. "Maybe you should work here." Darius smiled faintly. "I already have enough responsibilities." The answer earned a few quiet laughs, but this time the laughter sounded uncertain. Darius continued through the showroom. At a silver McLaren he asked about delivery schedules. At a red Ferrari he asked about allocation limits. Near a white Lamborghini he asked about acquisition costs and transportation expenses. The questions became increasingly specific. Brandon answered most of them, though not always comfortably. What irritated him most was that Darius seemed to know when an answer lacked precision. "What is the average turnover rate for this inventory category?" Darius asked. Brandon folded his arms. "Why does that matter?" "Because inventory that sits too long becomes expensive. These cars sell themselves." Darius looked around the showroom. "Do they?" The question landed harder than Brandon expected. Several employees immediately looked away. The dealership had experienced slower sales recently, though management rarely discussed it publicly. Brandon cleared his throat. "You ask a lot of questions. I like understanding how things work. Most customers ask about horsepower." "Horsepower matters," Darius said. "But business decisions matter more." The bright showroom suddenly felt smaller to Brandon. He could no longer tell whether Darius was genuinely shopping or conducting some kind of evaluation. Every question uncovered another layer of expertise. Every answer seemed to generate 3 more questions. Yet Darius never sounded confrontational. He remained polite. Curious. Calm. That calmness was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. A customer standing nearby finally spoke up. "You sound like you have worked in this industry." Darius looked at him briefly. "I have spent time around it." Brandon immediately jumped in. "Everyone spends time around cars. Watching videos does not make someone an expert." The comment earned a few scattered chuckles. Darius simply nodded. "That is true." Then he turned toward the far side of the showroom where several recently arrived vehicles sat waiting for final preparation. His eyes lingered there longer than expected. Brandon noticed it. "What are you looking at now?" Darius studied the vehicles for another moment before answering. "Potential." The word seemed simple enough, but something about the way he said it caused the room to grow quiet again. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, afternoon sunlight shifted across the glass. Reflections rolled over chrome surfaces and polished paint. Inside the showroom, Brandon felt control slipping away one conversation at a time. And for the first time since Darius had walked through the front doors, the manager began wondering whether he had misjudged the wrong man. The atmosphere inside the showroom had changed, even if nobody wanted to admit it. What had started as a moment of amusement was becoming something else entirely. Customers who had planned to leave remained near the display vehicles. Employees found reasons to stay within earshot. The polished floor reflected rows of exotic cars and clusters of people who were no longer focused on the inventory. They were focused on Darius. Brandon noticed it too. Every minute that passed seemed to shift attention away from the vehicles and toward the man he had dismissed the moment he walked through the door. That realization irritated him more than he cared to admit. He straightened his jacket and stepped closer. "You know," Brandon said loudly enough for others to hear, "for someone who asks so many questions, you still have not told us what exactly you are shopping for." Several nearby customers looked up. A few employees paused their conversations. Darius turned toward him calmly. "I am evaluating options." Brandon smiled. "That sounds expensive." A few people laughed. Darius simply nodded. "Good decisions usually are." The answer generated another brief silence. Brandon immediately pressed forward. "Then maybe we should save everyone some time." He gestured dramatically toward the rows of supercars surrounding them. The white lights above reflected across polished paint and chrome accents. "You keep talking about inventory, operations, and business strategy." His voice carried across the showroom floor. "Why not tell us which one you can actually afford?" Several heads turned. More phones appeared. The tension felt different now. Not playful. Expectant. Brandon pointed toward a black Lamborghini positioned near the center platform. "That one starts above $400,000. He pointed toward a limited production Ferrari. "That one costs even more." Then he swept his arm across the entire showroom. "And all of this?" He laughed. "That is not even a conversation most people can have." The employees closest to him chuckled automatically. Others remained silent. Darius looked around the room. His gaze moved across every vehicle, every display stand, every person watching. Yet he showed no sign of frustration. No embarrassment. No anger. That composure only encouraged Brandon. "Come on," Brandon said. "Let us be realistic." He took another step forward. "You cannot even afford the tires on half these cars." A few customers laughed again, though not as confidently as before. The words lingered in the bright air of the showroom. Darius heard them. Everyone did. The manager clearly expected a reaction. An argument. A retreat. Something. Instead, Darius looked toward the nearest vehicle and lightly rested his attention on the gleaming bodywork. The overhead lights created smooth ribbons of reflection across the paint. For a moment he seemed more interested in the car than the conversation. The calm, unsettled people. Brandon's smile began to look forced. "Nothing to say?" he asked. Darius finally looked at him. "You seem very confident." "I am. That can be useful." Brandon folded his arms. "And what is that supposed to mean?" Darius held his gaze for a second before answering. "Confidence works best when it is supported by facts." The showroom fell quiet again. Somewhere near the reception desk, a phone rang and quickly stopped. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Brandon felt dozens of eyes on him. He had wanted a public moment. He had wanted an audience. Now he had one. The difference was that he was no longer controlling the direction of the conversation. And although he did not realize it yet, the most important moment of the day was only minutes away. The showroom grew unusually quiet after Darius spoke. The laughter that had filled the room only minutes earlier seemed distant now, swallowed by the soft hum of climate control vents and the faint instrumental music drifting from hidden speakers overhead. Sunlight filtered through the massive glass windows and stretched across the polished floor in long bands of gold. Reflections moved slowly over the bodies of the supercars, sliding across carbon fiber, chrome accents, and flawless paint. Darius stood near the center of the showroom without saying another word. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He did not try to prove anything. Instead, he looked across the inventory as though he were studying a blueprint only he could see. Brandon remained several feet away, arms crossed tightly. He expected another response. He expected resistance. Most of all, he expected attention to return to him. Yet the room no longer felt under his control. Customers who had once laughed now watched quietly. Employees who usually followed Brandon's lead seemed uncertain. Even the sales staff standing near the reception area had stopped pretending not to listen. Darius reached into his pocket and removed his phone. The movement was simple, almost unremarkable, but several people immediately noticed. He unlocked the screen and read something briefly. His expression never changed. Then he typed a short message. No dramatic speech followed. No announcement. Just a few calm taps of his thumb against the screen. When he finished, he slipped the phone back into his pocket. Brandon smirked. Calling for backup. A few people laughed politely, though the sound faded almost as soon as it began. Darius glanced toward him. No, then what was so important? Brandon asked. Darius looked back toward the vehicles. Just confirming a detail. The answer frustrated Brandon more than any insult could have. Everything about Darius felt measured. Deliberate. Controlled. It was as though he was operating according to information nobody else possessed. The manager shifted his weight and looked around the showroom. Something felt different. He could not explain it, but the atmosphere had changed. The bright room seemed quieter. The polished floor seemed wider. Time itself appeared to slow. Darius walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dealership entrance. Outside, afternoon sunlight reflected off parked vehicles and passing traffic. Inside, the reflections from the glass painted shifting patterns across the showroom floor. He stood there for a moment with his hands relaxed at his sides. Not anxious. Not offended. Simply patient. A customer near the Ferrari display lowered his phone. Another quietly folded a brochure. Across the room, Kyle watched from behind a reception desk, unable to shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. Darius remained silent. The silence itself became powerful. Brandon tried to ignore the growing tension, but even he felt it now. It was the strange calm that settles over a room moments before everyone realizes they have misunderstood the situation. And somewhere beyond the showroom walls, unseen by anyone inside, events had already begun moving in a direction none of them expected. The first sign appeared outside the showroom windows. A black sedan rolled into the front lot and parked near the entrance. Then another arrived. Moments later, a third vehicle pulled in behind it. Customers near the windows noticed first. Conversations softened. Heads turned. Brandon followed their attention and frowned. The arrival of several professional-looking visitors was unusual, especially without a scheduled event on the calendar. Darius remained exactly where he was, standing near the glass with the same calm expression he had worn all afternoon. The automatic doors opened, allowing a brief rush of warm air into the climate-controlled showroom. 3 men and 2 women stepped inside carrying leather portfolios and tablet cases. Their appearance immediately commanded attention. Tailored suits. Purposeful movement. No hesitation. They looked around briefly before walking directly toward Darius. The room seemed to freeze. Brandon watched the group approach and felt a strange knot tighten in his chest. One of the men extended his hand. "Good afternoon, Mr. Coleman," he said. "We have everything prepared." Several employees exchanged confused looks. Kyle nearly dropped the paperwork he was holding. Brandon stared at Darius as if hearing the name for the first time. Darius shook the man's hand politely. "Thank you for coming." Another member of the group opened a portfolio and presented several documents. The woman beside him reviewed information on a tablet before nodding. Their professionalism was unmistakable. They were not friends arriving to offer support. They were specialists handling serious business. Brandon stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said. "What exactly is going on?" The man with the portfolio glanced at him. "We are finalizing a transaction." Brandon forced a smile. "A transaction for what?" The answer came immediately. "The full inventory acquisition request." Silence swept through the showroom. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. For several seconds the only sound came from the soft music playing overhead. Brandon blinked. "The what?" The woman holding the tablet looked up. "Mr. Coleman requested complete purchase figures for the available showroom inventory." A customer near the Ferrari display gasped softly. Another lowered his phone and stared. Brandon's confident expression began to crack. "You are serious?" The question sounded weaker than he intended. Darius met his eyes calmly. "I usually am." The legal team continued reviewing documents. Numbers appeared on screens. Inventory lists were verified. Vehicle identification records were confirmed. Everything happened with smooth efficiency. It was obvious this process had been planned long before anyone in the showroom understood what was unfolding. Brandon looked around and realized the audience had changed sides. Earlier they had laughed with him. Now they were staring at him. Employees who once followed his lead avoided eye contact. Customers stood motionless between multi-million-dollar vehicles, watching reality rearrange itself in front of them. One of the specialists turned to Darius. "The acquisition amount has been confirmed." Darius nodded. "Proceed." The words were simple. Yet they landed with the weight of a closing vault door. Brandon suddenly remembered every joke. Every assumption. Every dismissive comment. The bright showroom that had felt like his kingdom only an hour earlier now felt unfamiliar. Across rows of Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and McLarens, the truth finally became impossible to ignore. The man he had mocked was not pretending to belong there. He belonged at a level Brandon had never even imagined. The shock had not finished spreading through the showroom. Employees still stood frozen beside display vehicles. Customers remained motionless between rows of exotic cars worth millions of dollars. The legal team continued organizing documents with quiet efficiency while Darius watched calmly. For Brandon, however, the room felt completely different now. Every polished surface seemed to reflect his mistakes back at him. Every silent face reminded him of the assumptions he had made. He struggled to understand how quickly the situation had changed. Just minutes earlier he believed he controlled the conversation. Now he was struggling to keep pace with reality. One of the attorneys stepped away from the group and answered a brief phone call. After listening for several seconds, he nodded and returned to Darius. "Everything has been approved," he said. "The final party is on the way." Darius thanked him with a small nod. Brandon frowned. "Final party?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. The question hung in the air. Then the front doors opened once again. This time, the reaction was immediate. Several employees straightened their posture. Others whispered under their breath. Even Brandon looked surprised. Walking into the showroom was Richard Langford, the majority owner of the entire dealership group. He rarely appeared in person. Most employees only saw him during annual meetings or company announcements. Yet there he was, crossing the polished floor with purpose. The room grew even quieter. Richard glanced around briefly before his eyes settled on Darius. A warm smile appeared on his face. He extended his hand immediately. "Good to see you again," he said. "I appreciate you making time for this." Brandon felt the color drain from his face. Again. The word echoed in his mind. Again. They already knew each other. Darius shook his hand. "Thank you for coming personally." Richard laughed softly. "I would not miss this." Several customers exchanged stunned looks. Kyle stared openly now, no longer pretending to organize paperwork. Brandon stood completely still. Richard turned toward the legal team. "Are we ready?" One of the attorneys nodded. "Everything is complete." Richard looked back at Darius. "Then congratulations." The simple statement sent another wave of confusion through the showroom. Brandon finally found his voice. "Congratulations for what?" Richard glanced toward him. "You have not been informed." Nobody answered. Richard looked genuinely surprised. Then he smiled politely. "Mr. Coleman is not only acquiring the inventory." He paused briefly. "He is completing the purchase of the dealership group itself." Silence. Absolute silence. The word seemed too large for the room. Employees stared in disbelief. Customers looked from Richard to Darius and back again. Brandon felt as though the floor beneath him had shifted. His mind raced through every conversation from earlier that day. Every joke. Every insult. Every dismissive remark. Richard continued speaking. "The transition has been in development for months. Today was simply the final step." Darius remained calm throughout the announcement. He showed no triumph. No arrogance. No desire to embarrass anyone. He simply listened. That restraint somehow made the revelation even more powerful. Brandon looked at him and finally understood what had felt different. From the beginning, Darius had never entered the showroom hoping to impress anyone. He had entered as a man evaluating something he was preparing to own. And without realizing it, Brandon had spent the entire afternoon mocking the future owner standing right in front of him. The silence remained long after the announcement. No one seemed eager to break it. The bright showroom looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier, yet everything felt different. The Ferraris still gleamed beneath the lights. The Lamborghinis still sat on their elevated platforms. The polished floor still reflected every detail. But the balance of the room had shifted completely. Brandon stood near the center aisle, unable to escape the memory of his own words. He remembered every joke. Every assumption. Every dismissive glance. They replayed in his mind with painful clarity. Around him, employees quietly returned to their positions, though their attention never strayed far from Darius. Customers whispered among themselves. Several who had planned to leave remained in place, unwilling to miss what happened next. Richard Langford exchanged a few final comments with the attorneys before stepping aside. The legal team began organizing documents and preparing for the next stage of the transition. Through it all, Darius remained calm. There was no celebration. No dramatic speech. No attempt to embarrass anyone. His composure seemed to command more respect than any display of power ever could. Brandon finally took a step forward. His confidence was gone now. The arrogance that had filled the showroom earlier had vanished. For the first time all afternoon, he looked uncertain. "Mr. Coleman," he said quietly. The room seemed to pause again. Darius turned toward him. Brandon swallowed hard. "I owe you an apology." No one interrupted. No one moved. Even the distant music felt quieter. Brandon looked down briefly before continuing. "I judged you before I knew anything about you." His voice carried less certainty than before, but more honesty. "I assumed things I should not have assumed. I spoke to you with disrespect, and there is no excuse for that." The words were simple. There was no dramatic emotion behind them. Just truth. Darius listened without interruption. The sunlight outside had begun to soften, casting a warm glow through the enormous windows. Golden reflections stretched across the showroom floor and touched the sides of the vehicles. For a moment, nobody seemed interested in the cars at all. They were watching something more important. Brandon looked up again. "I was wrong." Darius studied him for a second. Then he nodded once. Not as a victor accepting surrender. Not as a billionaire enjoying a moment of superiority. Simply as a man acknowledging another person's honesty. "Thank you," he said. Brandon seemed surprised by the response. Darius glanced around the showroom. His eyes moved across employees, customers, and the long rows of supercars. "The truth is," he said calmly, "respect should never depend on what someone looks like, what they wear, or what you think they can afford." Nobody spoke. The words settled naturally into the silence. People reveal who they are long before they reveal what they own. Brandon lowered his eyes again. This time there was no argument. No defense. Only understanding. Darius offered a small smile and began walking toward the exit. The attorneys followed. Richard Langford joined them near the front doors. Behind them, the showroom remained still. Brandon watched as the future owner crossed the polished floor beneath rows of lights reflecting off millions of dollars in machinery. Yet none of those cars felt as significant as the lesson left behind. The doors opened. Warm evening light poured into the showroom. Darius stepped outside without looking back. Inside, nobody said a word. They simply stood there among the reflections, the silence, and the lingering realization that true worth had never been parked on the showroom floor. It had walked through the front door hours earlier.